Queen Valetha stood at the great window of her throne room watching the stars burn across the endless darkness of space, and she wondered how it had come to this, her empire which had conquered 1,000 worlds across 10,000 years, now seeking marriage with a species that had barely learned to walk among the stars. The Kavani High Council had debated for months, their voices rising and falling like thunder in the ancient chambers where decisions of war and peace had been made since before humanity had discovered fire, and in the end they had agreed that the humans controlled something the Empire needed more than pride. Earth sat at the junction of 7 major hyperspace lanes, a small blue world that had somehow positioned itself at the crossroads of galactic commerce, and the Corvani needed access to those routes if they hoped to maintain their dominance in the eastern spiral. Clear's throat armor had been discussed, of course, because the Corvani way had always been to take what they wanted, but the humans had proven surprisingly difficult to intimidate, and their technology, while young, showed a disturbing tendency toward rapid advancement that made the council nervous, so they had proposed marriage. Instead, a diplomatic union between the queen and a human representative, a bond that would tie the two species together and grant the Corvani the access they required, and the humans had accepted with what Valetha could only describe as enthusiasm that bored unsuspicious. She turned from the window as her chief advisor entered the room, his silver scales catching the light of the twin moons that hung above the capital city of Corveth Prime. "My Queen Admiral," Vexen said, bowing low in the traditional manner of the warrior caste, "the human delegation has arrived, and they have brought your intended husband." The Lithra 4 hearts beat in an unfamiliar rhythm, something that might have been anxiety in a lesser being, though she refused to name it as such. "What manner of man have they sent?" she asked, keeping her voice steady and cold, as befitting a ruler of her station. Vexen's expression shifted in a way that Valetha had learned to recognize over their many years of service together. It was the look he wore when delivering news that would displease. "Sir, they have sent a cultural attach, my queen, a man of no military rank, no noble blood, and no genetic enhancements. His name is Marcus Cole, and by all accounts he is the most ordinary human they could have selected." The insult landed exactly as Dexon had intended it to land, and Valetha felt the cold fire of anger rise in her chest. For 300 years she had ruled the Corvani Empire with wisdom and strength. She had crushed rebellions, negotiated treaties that spanned centuries, and led her fleets to victory against enemies that had threatened to extinguish her people, and now the humans dared to offer a common man as a husband. "They mock us," she said, her voice dropping to the dangerous whisper that her court had learned to fear. "Perhaps," Dexon replied carefully, "or perhaps they test us. The humans are strange creatures, my queen, and their motivations remain difficult to predict. Our intelligence suggests they are playing a deeper game than we understand." The Lithra considered this, her mind working through the possibilities with the speed that had made her legendary among her people. The humans were young to the galactic stage, barely a century removed from first contact, yet they had expanded with a determination that impressed even the elder races. They built colonies on worlds that other species had deemed uninhabitable. They adapted to environments that should have killed them. And they smiled, through negotiations with a patience that seemed endless, never revealing their true intentions until the moment they chose to act. Bring him to me. Commanded, I would see this ordinary human for myself. The throne room of Corveth Prime had been designed to intimidate, its ceilings rising so high that clouds sometimes formed among the ancient rafters, its walls lined with the weapons and armor of 10,000 years of conquest. And as Marcus Cole walked the long path to the throne, Velithro watched him with the predatory attention of a creature that had evolved to hunt. Among the stars, he was smaller than she had expected, standing only slightly taller than an average Corvani female, with dark hair that fell across a face that showed no remarkable features. His eyes were a common brown, his build neither muscular nor weak, and he wore simple clothing that held no rank or station, but he walked without fear, his pace steady and unhurried as he approached the throne where Velithra waited. And when he reached the appropriate distance, he bowed in a manner that suggested he had studied Corvani customs with some care. Queen Velithra, he said, his voice calm and pleasant, I am honored to meet you. Thank you for accepting this arrangement, and I hope our union will bring prosperity to both our peoples. Thethra studied him in silence, searching for any sign of deception or hidden strength, but she found nothing. He seemed exactly what the reports had described, an unremarkable man with an unremarkable presence. You understand what this marriage means? She asked, letting her displeasure color her words. I believe I do, Marcus replied, and something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. I am to be your husband, bound by the laws of your empire, subject to your authority in all matters of state. I will have no power here except what you choose to give me, and my role will be largely ceremonial. And this does not concern you, should it? He asked, and the question was so simple, so genuinely curious that Velithra found herself momentarily without response. The human delegation stood at the far end of the throne room, watching the exchange with expressions that could not quite read, and she noticed that several of them were smiling in a way that suggested they knew something she did not. The wedding will take place in 3 days, she said, finally, dismissing him with a wave of her clawed hand. My servants will show you to your quarters. I suggest you use the time to prepare yourself for life among my people. Marcus bowed again, that same careful, studied movement, and as he turned to leave, Velithra called out one more question. Tell me, human, why did your people choose you for this duty? He paused, looking back over his shoulder with an expression that seemed almost gentle. Because I asked them to, he said simply, and then he was gone, following the servants through the great doors and leaving Velithra alone with her confusion and her counsel. Admiral Lexan approached the throne, his scales rippling with the colors of unease. What do you make of him, my queen? Velithra did not answer immediately, her mind still working through the puzzle that Marcus Cole represented. He was too calm, too comfortable, too accepting of a situation that should have terrified any ordinary man. There is something wrong with him, she said at last. Something the humans are not telling us. No man walks willingly into the heart of an alien empire without fear unless he carries a secret that makes fear unnecessary. Shall I have him investigated? Yes, Velithra replied, rising from her throne and walking toward the window. Once more, use every resource available. I want to know everything about Marcus Cole, from the moment of his birth to the day he stepped onto my world. But even as she gave the order, some part of her knew that the investigation would find nothing, because the humans had sent him knowing he would be examined, knowing every detail of his life would be scrutinized. They had sent him anyway, with those strange smiles on their faces, and Velithra could not shake the feeling that she was missing something important, something that would change everything she thought she knew about the quiet, ordinary man who would soon be her husband. The stars burned on in the darkness, indifferent to the concerns of queens and empires. And somewhere in the palace, Marcus Cole was settling into his new home with the patience of someone who had all the time in the universe. 6 months had passed since the wedding ceremony that had bound Marcus Cole to Queen Velithra of the Corvani Empire. And in that time, the human had proven himself to be exactly what he appeared to be: patient, kind, and utterly unremarkable. The investigation that Admiral Dexon had ordered revealed nothing suspicious. Marcus had been born in a small city on Earth called Portland, raised by parents who worked ordinary jobs, educated schools that produced millions of similar graduates each year. He had worked as a cultural liaison for the human government, traveling between worlds to smooth diplomatic relations, and his record showed nothing but competence and dedication. No military training appeared in his files, no combat experience marked his history, no genetic modifications enhanced his body beyond the standard human baseline. He was by every measure the Corvani could devise, exactly the common man they had been told to expect. And yet Velithra could not stop watching him, had learned the Corvani language within 2 months, speaking it with an accent that charmed the court servants and a precision that impressed the scholars. He had memorized the 1,000 years of protocol required for royal consorts, never once committing an error that would embarrass his position. And he had made himself useful in small ways that accumulated into something larger than any single action. The palace library, which had been neglected for generations, now hummed with activity because Marcus spent hours there each day reading the ancient histories and asking questions that forced the archivists to dig into records they had long forgotten. The diplomatic corps reported that human Corvani relations had improved measurably since the marriage, with trade agreements flowing more smoothly and cultural exchanges increasing beyond expectation. Even the servants who had initially regarded the human with suspicion and barely concealed contempt now spoke of him with fondness. He remembered their names, asked about their families, and treated them with a respect that was uncommon even among Corvani nobility. He is not what I expected, Velithra admitted one evening, speaking to Admiral Dexon in the privacy of her personal chambers, while Marcus attended a function elsewhere in the palace. In what way? My queen, Velithra struggled to articulate the feeling that had been growing in her chest, the strange warmth that appeared whenever Marcus entered a room, the curiosity that drove her to seek his company when she could have spent her time on matters of state. He asks questions, she said, finally endless questions about everything: our military structure, our history, our enemies, our fears. And when I answer, he listens, with such complete attention that I feel as if no one has ever truly heard me. Before, Vexen's scales shifted to the gray of concern, and he chose his next words with obvious care. My queen, I must ask, do you have feelings for this human? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that Valithra did not want to examine. She was a queen, ruler of 1,000 worlds, and her hearts did not flutter for common men from backwater planets. And yet when Marcus smiled at her across the breakfast table, when his hand brushed against hers during formal dinners, when he looked at her with those unremarkable brown eyes that somehow saw past every mask she wore, something inside her responded in ways she could not control. I am intrigued by him, she said, which was true but not the whole truth. He represents a puzzle I have not yet solved, and I find myself unwilling to set that puzzle aside. 2 weeks later the assassins came. They breached the palace through the old service tunnels that had been forgotten by all except the most thorough historians, moving with the silent efficiency of professionals who had trained their entire lives for this moment. They wore the colors of House Vexer, a rival faction that had long disputed Valithra's right to the throne, and their weapons were designed to kill Cavani royalty with maximum suffering. The alarm woke Valithra from deep sleep, and she immediately reached for the blade she kept beneath her pillow. Her warrior training taking control as her guards rushed to secure the royal chambers, but when she turned to wake Marcus, she found his side of the bed empty, the sheets cold as if he had left hours ago. Fear gripped her then, not for herself, but for her strange human husband who had no weapons, no training, no way to defend himself against killers who would see him as nothing more than an obstacle to be removed. And she fought against her guards' attempts to evacuate her, demanding they search for Marcus before they fled. They found him 20 minutes later, after the assassins had been killed or captured, after the palace had been secured and the immediate threat had passed. He was sitting in the library, a book open in his lap and a cup of tea cooling on the table beside him, as calm as if nothing unusual had occurred. Marcus the Lither rushed to him, checking his body for wounds before she could stop herself, her hands running over his arms and chest with an urgency that surprised them both. I'm fine, he said, that gentle amusement returning to his eyes. I heard some commotion, but I assumed the guards would handle it. I didn't want to get in the way. You weren't afraid, she demanded, her voice rising with the frustration of relief. Should I have been? He asked the same question he had asked on the day they first met. And Valithra found herself once again without an adequate response. Admiral Vexen arrived moments later, his scales blazing with the red of battle fury, and he looked at Marcus with an expression that mixed suspicion with something that might have been grudging respect. Assassins avoided this entire wing of the palace, he reported. They moved directly toward the royal chambers without ever approaching the library. It was as if they did not know you were here, Consort Marcus, or as if they had been specifically ordered to leave you alone. Marcus closed his book and set it aside, his movements unhurried and relaxed. That seems fortunate, he said simply, and Velitha noticed that he did not seem surprised by the information. Later that night, after the palace had returned to its normal routines and the investigations had begun in earnest, Valitha lay awake in her bed and thought about her husband. The assassins had known the palace layout perfectly, had bypassed security systems that should have been impenetrable, had moved with a precision that spoke of months of planning, yet they had somehow missed the one room where the human consort spent most of his time, the room he had been in when they struck, the room they would have passed on their way to their primary target. It could have been coincidence, but Velithra had not ruled for 300 years by believing in coincidence. She turned to look at Marcus, who lay beside her with his eyes closed and his breathing steady, and she wondered what secrets hid behind that ordinary face. "Where do you go at night?" she asked quietly, knowing he was not truly asleep. His eyes opened, and for just a moment she thought she saw something in their depths that did not belong to a simple cultural attach. A stillness await the shadow of something vast and old and patient. But then he smiled, and he was Marcus again, her strange and gentle husband who asked too many questions and remembered every servant's name. "I have trouble sleeping sometimes," he said. "Human thing, I take walks through the palace to clear my head." It was a reasonable explanation, and Valithru accepted it, because the alternative required her to question everything she thought she knew about the man she had married. But as she drifted towards sleep, she promised herself that she would discover the truth. Eventually Marcus Cole was hiding something, and one day she would learn what it was. She only hoped that when the revelation came, it would not destroy everything they had begun to build together. In the darkness of the royal chambers, Marcus listened to his wife's breathing slow into the rhythms of sleep, and he allowed himself a small smile that no one would ever see. Assassins had been a test arranged by parties he would deal with later, and they had performed exactly as expected. House Vexer would find their leadership mysteriously decimated in the coming weeks, their schemes unraveled by series of unfortunate coincidences that would never trace back to their true source. For now he had a role to play, a wife to protect, and a timeline to maintain. The real threat was still years away, and he had much work to do before it arrived, but that could wait until morning. For the night he was simply Marcus Cole, common human, devoted husband, and the most dangerous man in the empire that no one knew to fear. The warning came too late, as warnings often do when ancient enemies returned from the darkness between stars. 3 years had passed since Marcus Cole had married Queen Valithra. 3 years of quiet diplomacy and growing affection. 3 years during which the human consort had become an accepted fixture of the Corvani court, and in that time, Valithra had almost forgotten her suspicions, almost convinced herself that her husband was exactly what he appeared to be. She remembered her doubts on the morning the sky turned black. Admiral Dexon burst into the royal breakfast chamber with his scales blazing the white of terror, a color Velithra had never seen him wear in all their centuries together, and his words tumbled out in a rush that stripped away all pretense of military discipline. "My queen, the Wraith Collective has returned." They appeared in system without warning, their shadow fleet emerging from fold space and numbers we cannot calculate. Our defense grid has gone dark, our communications are jammed, and our outer fleet is being systematically destroyed. Valithra rose from her chair, her 4 hearts pounding in a rhythm that matched the thunder of Distant explosions now reaching the palace through the atmosphere. The Wraith Collective had been the terror of her grandmother's generation, a race of beings that existed somewhere between energy and matter, feeding on the life force of living creatures and leaving dead worlds in their wake. They had nearly extinguished the Corvani species 2,000 years ago, and only a desperate alliance of elder races had driven them back into the void between galaxies. Every child of the Empire grew up hearing stories of the Wraith War, tales of horror that taught them fear and survival in equal measure, and now those stories were becoming reality. Again, the nightmare returning to claim what it had been denied so long ago. How is this possible? Valitha demanded, striding toward the war room with Dexon at her side and Marcus following silently behind them. Our sensors should have detected their approach months in advance. We should have had time to prepare. Their technology has advanced beyond anything in our records, Dexon replied, his voice steady now that he had delivered his terrible news. They are using dimensional fold techniques that our systems cannot track. They simply appeared, my queen, as if they had been waiting in the shadows all along. The war room was chaos when they arrived, officers shouting over each other as tactical displays flickered with updates that grew more desperate by the minute. The holographic projection at the center of the room showed Corveth Prime, surrounded by a ring of shadow ships, each one larger than the greatest Corvani dreadnought, each one pulsing with the dark energy that was the collective signature. Current casualties? The Lithra asked, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. 60% of our orbital defense fleet destroyed or disabled, a young officer reported, her scales gray with shock. Ground-based installations are failing across the planet. Civilian communications are down. We estimate the collective can begin their feeding operation within 6 hours if we cannot mount an effective counterattack. Valith studied the tactical display, her mind racing through options that grew fewer with each passing moment. The Corvani had rebuilt their military since the last Wraith War, had developed weapons specifically designed to harm the collective semi-ethereal forms, but none of those preparations had anticipated an attack of this scale. What forces do we have remaining? The home fleet is intact, my queen, but they are surrounded and outgunned. Our allies in the neighboring systems have been contacted, but the jamming is preventing clear communication. We cannot confirm if our calls for help have been received. Admiral Dexon stepped forward, his scale shifting to the dark blue of difficult duty. My queen, we must consider evacuation. If we can get you off-world before the collective tightens their grip, the Empire can survive to fight another day and abandon my people. The Lither's voice dropped to the dangerous register that made lesser beings tremble. I will not flee while Corvani citizens die. I will not hide while my warriors sacrifice themselves to protect their home world. Then you will die with them, Vexen said bluntly, because he had served her long enough to speak truth. Even when it burned, and the Empire will fall without your guidance. This is not cowardice, my queen, this is mathematics. You are the keystone of our civilization, and if you fall, everything crumbles. The argument might have continued, might have raged until the collective ships began their final approach, but a new voice cut through the tension with calm authority that silenced every other sound in the room. "May I make a suggestion?" Everyone turned to look at Marcus, who had been standing quietly at the edge of the war room, watching the tactical displays with an expression that Velitha had never seen on his face before. It was not the gentle curiosity of a scholar or the patient interest of a diplomat, was the cold, calculating focus of a predator evaluating prey. Admiral Dexon recovered first, his scales flushing with the red of irritation. "This is a military matter, Consort Marcus. Your advice, while appreciated in diplomatic affairs, has no place here." "I understand," Marcus said, and he moved toward the holographic display with a walk that Velithra suddenly realized she had never truly seen before. He had always moved with careful, deliberate steps that seemed designed to avoid attention. But now he walked like someone who expected the universe to make room for him. "But I have studied your military history extensively. I have read every account of the First Wraith War, and I believe your current tactical approach is based on assumptions that no longer apply. Our admirals have trained their entire lives for this moment," Dexon said, his voice rising with anger. "They do not need instruction from a human who was never commanded so much as a patrol ship. Your admirals are preparing for the war your grandmothers fought," Marcus replied, his tone unchanged by the admiral's hostility. "They are assuming the collective will behave as it did 2,000 years ago, pressing their attack until your defenses collapse, feeding on the population until the planet is drained. But look at their formation. They are not advancing." He gestured at the tactical display, pointing to the ring of shadow ships that surrounded Corveth Prime. "They've achieved complete tactical superiority. They could begin their assault at any moment, yet they wait. Why would they wait?" The Lithur studied the display with new eyes, and she saw what Marcus had seen. The collective fleet was not moving, not attacking, simply holding position in a pattern that seemed almost defensive. "They fear something," she said, slowly, the realization dawning like light in darkness. "Yes," Marcus agreed, and he turned to look at her with those ordinary brown eyes that suddenly seemed anything but ordinary. "They fear reinforcement. They know that if they commit to a full assault, they will be vulnerable to a counterattack. They are waiting to ensure no help is coming before they strike." "Then we are still lost," Dexon said bitterly. "We have no reinforcements to call. Our allies cannot reach us in time. The collective merely exercises patience, and patience costs them nothing." Marcus smiled, and Velithra felt a chill run down her spine. That had nothing to do with the temperature of the war room. "Amal Lexon," he said quietly, "I believe there is something you should know about me." He reached for his wrist, touching a communicator that Velithra had never noticed before, a device that seemed to shimmer in and out of visibility as if it existed in more than one dimension at once. "My name is not Marcus Cole, and I am not a cultural attach. I have worn that identity for 3 years at the request of my superiors, but the time for masks has ended." The war room fell silent, every eye fixed on the human who stood at the center of the tactical display, with the calm confidence of someone who had just cleared his throat. "Changed the rules of reality. Who are you?" Velithra asked, and her voice was steady despite the fear and wonder wearing in her hearts. Marcus looked at her, and for the first time since their wedding day, she saw him clearly, not The gentle husband who read books in the library, not the patient consort who charmed servants and navigated court politics, but something older and harder, and infinitely more dangerous. I am General Marcus Cole of the Adamant Protocol, he said, and I am here to save your empire. He pressed a symbol on his communicator and spoke words in a language that made the air itself vibrate with power. All units, this is Command Actual. Drop the veil, we are weapons free, and the space around Corveth Prime began to tear itself apart. The fabric of space screamed as reality folded in on itself, and from the wounds in the universe, ships began to emerge that should not have existed. 12 dreadnoughts materialized around Corveth Prime, each one a mountain of black metal and killing purpose that dwarfed even the collective shadow vessels. They bore no flags of the Earth unity government, no markings that any Corvani database could identify, nothing but a single symbol etched into their hulls. Lines of burning silver, a human hand closed into a fist surrounded by a ring of stars. The war room erupted in chaos. Officers shouting conflicting reports as their sensors struggled to process what they were seeing. These ships registered as impossible, their energy signatures fluctuating in patterns that violated every law of physics. The Kulani understood. Admiral Dexon stared at the display with scales that had shifted to pure white, the color of shock so profound it bordered on death. Those vessels are larger than anything in any Gnome fleet, he whispered. Their power readings exceed our entire orbital defense network combined. Where did they come from? How have they been hidden? Marcus stood at the center of the chaos with perfect calm, his fingers dancing across the communicator on his wrist as data streams flow through connections that seem to exist outside normal space. The Adamant Protocol has been operational for 300 years, he said, his voice carrying the weight of truth too large to be contained, since humanity first made contact with the galactic community, since we learned that the universe held threats that could extinguish our species in moments. We have been preparing. He turned to the tactical display, and with a gesture that seemed almost casual, he began rearranging the Corvani fleet formations. Your ships are positioned to defend Corveth Prime, which is exactly what the collective expects. They have calculated your response based on your military doctrine, your historical patterns, your psychological profile. But they have not calculated for this. The holographic display shifted, showing the protocol dreadnoughts spreading into a formation that made no tactical sense to Canny. They were not protecting the planet, not engaging the enemy, simply moving into positions that seemed random and purposeless. What are they doing? The Lythra demanded, stepping closer to her husband with a mixture of awe and fear burning in her chest. They are establishing kill corridors, Marcus replied. The collective ships operate on a hive intelligence, each vessel connected to a central command nexus that coordinates their movements. If we destroy the nexus, the individual ships will be crippled, reduced to fragments that can be eliminated at leisure. Admiral Vexen forced his scales back toward the blue of duty, his military training reasserting itself despite the impossibility of what he was witnessing. The command nexus will be the most heavily defended vessel in their formation. Our weapons have never been able to penetrate collective shielding. At that level, Marcus smiled, and there was nothing gentle in the expression. Your weapons, Admiral, were designed by beings who could not imagine what humanity would create in the darkness. Between wars, our weapons were designed by people who knew that one day we would face something like this, and who refused to accept any outcome except total victory. He pressed another symbol on his communicator, and a new channel opened with a burst of encrypted communication that made the Kavani systems flicker with interference. Protocol Alpha Team, this is command. Actual, the Nexus is your primary target. You are cleared for dimensional breach. I repeat, you are cleared for dimensional breach. The words meant nothing to Valithra, but she saw their effect on the battle unfolding above her world. One of the protocol dreadnoughts began to glow with an inner light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, its hull rippling as if it existed in multiple states simultaneously. What is dimensional breach? She asked, though part of her was not certain. She wanted to know the answer. Our scientists discovered long ago that the collective exists partly in a dimension parallel to our own, Marcus explained, his eyes fixed on the tactical display with an intensity that made Valithra's scales itch. Their ships anchored themselves in normal space, but their consciousness, their power source, their essence exists in that other place. Our weapons cannot reach them. There, the glowing dreadnought fired, and the weapon it unleashed was not light or plasma or any form of energy the Corvani had names for. It was a tear in existence itself, a wound in the fabric of space that spread across the distance between the protocol ship and the collective Nexus in less than a heartbeat. But we found a way to follow them. The collective Nexus ship, a vessel the size of a small moon that had been untouchable by any weapon the galaxy had ever produced, simply ceased to exist. The tearing reality passed through it and continued on, leaving nothing behind but scattered particles and the screaming echoes of dying consciousness. For a moment there was silence in the war room, a silence so complete that Valithra could hear her own heartbeats thundering in her chest. Then the collective fleet began to die without their central coordination. The shadow ships fell into chaos, their movements becoming erratic and uncontrolled. The protocol dreadnoughts moved through them like predators through a field of prey, their weapons tearing through collective vessels with a precision that seemed almost artistic in its efficiency. But it was not only the dreadnoughts that fought. Smaller craft poured from their launch bays, vessels crewed by soldiers in armor that seemed to absorb a light itself, and they boarded the disabled collective ships with a speed that the Kavani could barely track. Those are adamant protocol operatives, Marcus said, watching the tactical display with the focus of a commander who had orchestrated 1,000 such battles. They have trained since childhood in facilities hidden from every intelligence service in the galaxy. Their bodies have been enhanced beyond anything the public world knows exists, and their only purpose is to ensure that threats to humanity and our allies are eliminated permanently. Admiral Dexon found his voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. How long has humanity been hiding this? How long have you been watching us, pretending to be the young species that needed guidance and protection? Marcus did not answer immediately, his attention drawn to a particular section of the battle where a cluster of collective ships was attempting to flee. Toward the edge of the system, Admiral Karth, he said into his communicator. The northeastern quadrant is attempting to break through. Execute containment. Protocol 7, 3 dreadnoughts shifted their positions with a grace that should have been impossible for vessels their size, and the fleeing collective ships found themselves trapped in a crossfire that left no avenue of escape. To answer your question, Admiral Dexon Marcus said finally, turning to face the Gani officer with eyes that held centuries of secrets humanity has been preparing since the day we realized we were not alone in the universe. We saw the elder races, we studied their histories, we learned about the threats that had nearly destroyed them time and again. And we decided that we would not rely on anyone else for our survival. The battle was ending, the last collective ships either destroyed or disabled. There, shadow halls drifting through space as the protocol forces methodically ensured no survivors remained, and Valith watched her husband command the final stages of a victory that should have been impossible. Why hide this power? She asked the question that burned hotter than any other. Why pretend to be weak when you could have demanded respect, could have claimed dominion over the galaxy itself? Marcus turned to look at her, and for a moment she saw a pasta general pass the secrets and the centuries of preparation to the man who had sat beside her at breakfast every morning for 3 years, who had learned her language and her customs, who had looked at her with warmth that she now understood was genuine despite everything else that had been false. Because true strength is not measured by what you can take, he said softly, it is measured by what you choose to protect. Humanity hid the protocol because we did not want to rule the galaxy. We wanted to ensure it would survive long enough for species like yours to reach their full potential. He reached out and took her hand, a gesture so simple and so human that it made Valithra's hearts ache with conflicting emotions. The collective was always coming, Valithra. We knew that before we ever made contact with your people, and we needed all eyes who would stand with us when the darkness returned, not servants who would cower behind our ships. The war room fell silent as the last collective vessel was destroyed, its death marked by a brief flare of light that faded into the eternal darkness of space. And Valithra looked at the man she had married, the man she had thought she knew, the man who had just revealed himself to be something beyond her comprehension. What happens now? She asked. Marcus smiled, and this time the expression held something of the gentleness she had grown to love. Now we talk, he said, about everything I could not tell you before, about everything humanity has hidden, about the alliance I was sent here to build, and then together we face whatever comes next. The stars still burned above Corvath Prime, but they looked different now, full of possibilities that Valithra had never imagined. And beside her stood a human who had protected her world with power beyond measure, who had kept the faith of his mission for 3 years without ever breaking, and who had the throne room of Corvath Prime had never been so quiet, the ancient walls bearing witness to a conversation that would reshape the galaxy's understanding of humanity. Forever, Valithra sat upon her throne, her scales shifting through colors that had no names, while Marcus stood before her in the same spot where he had first bowed 3 years ago. He was different now. Or perhaps he had always been different, and she was only now seeing him clearly. He wore the uniform of the Adamant Protocol, black fabric that seemed to drink in light, with silver insignia on his shoulders that marked a rank beyond anything the Kurani military structure could comprehend. That Admiral Dexon stood at the Queen's right hand, his scales settled into a permanent gray of uncertainty that had not changed since the battle ended. Around them the highest members of the Corvani Court waited in silence, their eyes fixed on the human who had saved their world and shattered their understanding of the universe in a single afternoon. You were placed here, Belithra said, her voice steady despite the storm raging in her hearts. From the beginning, our marriage was a strategic operation. I volunteered, Marcus corrected gently. There were other operatives who could have taken this assignment, soldiers and diplomats with centuries more experience, but I asked my superiors to give it to me. I wanted to be the one who came here. Why? Marcus was silent for a long moment, gathering thoughts that seemed to carry weight beyond words. 300 years ago, when I was first recruited into the protocol, I was told that my purpose would be to protect humanity by any means necessary. I was trained to kill, to deceive, to sacrifice everything in service of that mission, and for 2 centuries that is exactly what I did. He began to pace slowly, his movements careful and precise, the habits of a warrior who never truly relaxed. I have commanded the death of worlds, Belithra. I have ordered strikes against species that threatened our survival, have made decisions that ended billions of lives before they could become billions more. And I have never regretted those choices, because they were necessary, because mercy shown to those who would destroy us is suicide dressed in kindness. The court shifted uncomfortably at these words, but Belithra kept her gaze fixed on her husband, waiting for him to continue. But a century ago, something began to change inside me. I started to question whether survival alone was enough, whether protecting humanity's existence meant anything if we became monsters in the process. And I realized that I needed something more than duty to give my life meaning. He stopped pacing and turned to face her directly, his brown eyes holding hers is with an intensity that made her scales flush with warmth she could not control. When the council decided that the Kavani were potential allies worth cultivating, when they began searching for an operative to embed in your empire, I saw an opportunity not just to serve the protocol, but to discover if there was still a part of me that could be more than a weapon. So I was an experiment, Belithra asked, and she was surprised to find that the words held no anger, only a desperate need to understand. You were hope, Marcus said simply, hope that after 300 years of war and sacrifice, I could still remember how to be human. And from the moment I walked into this throne room, from the moment I saw you standing there with suspicion in your eyes and fire in your heart, I knew that my hope had not been misplaced. He stepped closer to the throne, crossing the invisible boundary the protocol demanded he respect. Andra did not stop him. Every question I asked about your history, every hour I spent in your library, every conversation we shared over breakfast and beneath the stars, none of it was pretense. I was genuinely trying to understand your people, your culture, your soul, and in the process, I found something I had not expected. What did you find? I found a species worth fighting for, Marcus said, not because you were useful to humanity's strategic interests, but because you were good, because your people created art and music and literature that made me weep with joy, because your children laughed and your elders taught wisdom, and your warriors died with honor for causes they believed in. His voice grew softer, more intimate, speaking now to Valithra alone despite the dozens of witnesses surrounding them. And I found a queen who challenged me with every word, who saw through my masks even when she did not understand what lay beneath, who made me feel alive in ways I had forgotten were possible. Vithra rose from her throne, her towering form closing the distance between them until they stood face to face, the human and the Corvani, the warrior and the queen. Your feelings for me, she said, echoing the question she had asked when the battle ended. Were they strategic? Marcus reached up and touched her face, his small human hand warm against her scales, and his eyes held no deception, no calculation, no mission parameters. In 300 years of service, you are the only thing I have ever chosen for myself, he said. The protocol gave me orders to build an alliance, to prepare your empire for the war that was coming, to ensure the Cavani would stand with humanity when the final battles are fought, but loving you was never part of my mission. The word hung in the air between them, a confession that carried more weight than any revelation about hidden fleets or secret protocols. Love, Bifra repeated, tasting the human concept on her tongue. I know it may not mean the same thing to your people, Marcus said. I know that our species experience emotion differently, process connection through different frameworks. But what I feel for you, what I felt, growing stronger every day for 3 years, is what my people call love. It is the willingness to sacrifice everything for another person's happiness, to choose their well-being over your own survival, to find meaning in their existence that transcends all other purposes. Alithra was quiet for a long moment, her four hearts beating in rhythms that had no precedent in her long life. Around them, the court held its collective breath, waiting for their queen to respond to this unprecedented declaration. The Cani, do not use that word lightly, she said. Finally, when we bond with another, it is for life, a commitment that cannot be broken by time or distance or even death. And you are asking me to believe that a human, a species that forms and dissolves partnerships with casual frequency, is capable of that depth of connection? I'm not asking you to believe anything, Marcus replied. I am telling you what is true and leaving the choice of belief to you. But consider this: I have lived for 3 centuries. Thethra, I have seen empires rise and fall, watch stars die and be reborn, carried the weight of decisions that shaped the fate of billions, and in all that time I have never felt what I feel when I look at you. He took her hands in his, the gesture so small and so human, and so impossibly brave. You can reject me, you have every right to be angry, to feel betrayed, to cast me out of your empire and never speak my name again. But do not doubt that my love for you is real, because it is the realest thing I have ever known. The looked into his eyes, searching for deception and finding only truth. She thought about the 3 years they had spent together, the small kindnesses and the quiet moments, the way he had learned her language and her customs, the way he had asked endless questions, not to gather intelligence but to genuinely understand her world. She thought about the way he had protected her empire without ever asking for recognition, way he had revealed himself only when necessity demanded it, the way he had stood before her court with perfect composure and admitted to centuries of deception while simultaneously declaring love that transcended all his training, and she realized that she had known the truth about Marcus Cole long before he had spoken it. She had known it in the way he smiled at her across the breakfast table, in the way his hand brushed against hers during formal dinners, in the way he looked at her as if she was the most important being in a universe full of wonders. The galaxy will learn of this, she said, and her voice carried the weight of royal proclamation. They will learn that humanity is not the young species they believed, that your people have been watching and preparing, that the adamant protocol has been standing guard against threats that most civilizations cannot imagine. Yes, Marcus agreed, the time for secrets has ended. What comes next will require allies who know the truth, who can prepare their own people for the challenges ahead. And what challenges are those? Marcus' expression grew serious, the weight of command settling back onto his shoulders. The Wraith Collective was not the only threat lurking in the darkness. Valetra, they were merely the first to return. There are others, ancient powers that have been sleeping for millennia, forces that make the collective seem like children playing at war. He squeezed her hands gently, his grip warm and steady. Humanity has been preparing for a long time, but we cannot face what is coming alone. We need allies, true allies, species who will stand beside us, not because we forced them or deceived them, but because they choose to. And I hope, more than I have ever hoped for anything, that the Corvani will be among them. Valetra considered his words, considered everything that had happened since the shadow ships first appeared in her sky, considered the man standing before her who had worn so many masks and yet remained somehow honest beneath them all. You ask much, she said.